All right, today we're in Titus chapter 3. And JD, for me, just right away I see in verse 1, Paul tells Titus, remind the believers to submit to the government and its officers. They should be obedient, always ready to do what is good. So in chapter 2, he was talking to young men and old men and young women and older women and even slaves or workers. And now he even, just in case we thought he wasn't going to bring politics into it, he even tells Titus, hey, remind Christians that they should actually submit to the government.
And this has been important probably throughout history, but it certainly hits home today.
Yeah.
With how we are politically so divided as a country.
Yeah, and if some people say, well, they didn't have government leaders like we do today, he wouldn't say that. Paul wouldn't say that today. I would say look it up in your history book, because the government at the time of Paul's writing was more wicked and tyrannical.
Oh, absolutely.
Than today.
And yes, and so it was even harder to submit to the government back then.
That's right.
By far than it is today.
That's right.
And I like in verse 2 where he talks about being gentle and true humility to everyone. He references humility later, and I think that's because he's trying to tell Christians that once you get the Spirit and you recognize truth and you start working toward the truth, we sometimes look at other people and we look down upon them. And we forget that we're not better than them. We're sinners just like them. We just happen to have discovered the truth, and it's only by God's grace that we're saved, not by our actions.
Yeah, and that's what Paul's saying in verse 3. He says, we too were foolish and disobedient, so don't think we're above someone. We were misled, and we became slaves to our many lusts and pleasures. And so that was this condition of most people in Crete. And so this is the foundation for sharing your faith with someone, is having that kind of humility and gentleness, rather than, I think, what some Christians can grow into, which is this arrogance, this spiritual arrogance, that I'm better than you. And Paul is saying there's no room for that in Crete, and I think there's no room for that anywhere, even today.
I agree. And kind of on that same line there in chapter 9, he talks about, or verse 9, excuse me, he talks about having foolish discussions with people. And he actually gives some real practical advice where he says, sit down and discuss it with them once, maybe twice. But if after 2 times, if you're not able to persuade them, just go on to something else. It's kind of it's an interesting verse in the fact that do you take it as a hard turn away from somebody? Mm-hmm. Are they talking about minor differences? Are they talking about deep differences?
Yeah.
And probably your response is similar, but not the same.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand in verse 10, he's saying you need to give these people who are causing divisions a first and second warning, but then after that have nothing to do with them. Whereas in verse 1 and 2, or in verse 2 in particular, he says, be gentle and show true humility to everyone. So someone might say, wait a second, I don't understand what he's saying. But remember, in verse 2, he's talking about reaching, the lost, reaching people, Cretans maybe who don't know the gospel yet. Whereas going back down to verse 10, and even in verse 9, he's talking about Judaizers or so-called Christians who had come into the church, but they were actually preaching heresy. And what Paul is trying to tell Titus is, don't let this kind of heresy exist in the church, because it'll take down the church. And so I think that Paul is drawing hard lines when it comes to doctrinal stuff that is wrong. He's saying you should just, kick them out. Don't let them be leaders in your church, because that'll confuse people and the gospel won't be heard. But when it comes to reaching the lost, or even just another believer in the church, I think he's saying be humble and gracious and patient and give people a second chance.
Yeah, makes sense.
Now, at the end of this then, starting in verse 12, Paul then is just sort of signing off on this letter. Remember, this was a letter that Paul wrote to Titus, a leader in the early church. So this wasn't a book. This wasn't a pamphlet. This was actually a letter. The churchy word for that is an epistle, but it's a letter that Paul wrote to a guy named Titus. And so remember that even as you read this, that this whole letter was written to a specific person, but I still think we can draw out principles that Paul is teaching to Titus to use for our church today.